One can secure the bag.
Ready?
Keep the bag, King Walker.
Let's go, 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 get some money, fuck they plan. I told her take this plan B and stop playing. I'm tired of buying jewelry, finna buy some land. They still tryna figure out who I am, who I be. Pillow talking to these hoes, that shit weak. They say money talk, put diamonds in my teeth. I be Louis down with Jordans on my feet. Niggas messed up in your yard like trick or treat. You better play your cards right, you better not ever reach. For this chain over here, I put you underneath. Yeah, I ripped it 5, but I put you 6 feet deep, nigga. Let's go, 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 get some money, fuck that bullshit. Hell yeah, I made some meals off my tours, bitch. Hell yeah, I made some meals off my merch too. I got yellow diamond, Super Saiyan Goku. These niggas only killers on Pro Tools. Old lame ass nigga, I ain't got no juice. Old lame ass nigga, I ain't got no motion. Means I flexing on these niggas like I'm Hulk Hogan. Yeah, let's go, let's go, let's go, let's go, let's go, let's go. Handle business. I'm shitting on the industry and God is my witness. Nigga, let's go, 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 let's go.
I see you've brought guests.
Meet you soon. The pleasure is mine.
Полевых цветов веночек, в утренней росе цветок, соловья запев свисточек, сок березовый глоток, тишины послушать волю, по тропинке в лес густой, поболтать с березкой вдоволь про него и про любовь. Матушка земля, белая березонька, для меня святая Русь, для других занозанька. Матушка земля, ой, белая березонька, для меня святая Русь, для других занозанька. Сколько мне еще годочков у кукушки поспрашать про любовь утренняя росе цветок. Соловья запев, свисточек, сок, березовый глоток. Тишины послушать волю, по тропинке в лес густой. Поболтать с березкой вдоволь про него и про любовь. Матушка земля, белая березонька, для меня святая Русь, для трудника сановника. Матушка земля, ой, белая березонька, для меня святая Русь, для трудника сановника. Мне еще годочка кукушки поспрашать, про любовь свою девичью на ромашке погадать. Ключевой воды, соды, соток свежий
Valera versus Thrall.
For Doomhammer.
Watch your back.
I see you've brought gas.
Valera versus Tavish. I'll make my own fortune.
Watch.
I see you've brought gas.
Who are you?
The pleasure is mine.
By battle and sword.
Machiavelli's The Prince is one of the most important turning points in the history of Western political philosophy.
Good morning, YouTube. So, I know that... Good morning, YouTube. So, I know that you flock this channel because I am such a sunny and optimistic person.
my leadership.
I bring cheer
Here we
in a
go.
world of gloom. You may face some difficulties in your life, but you know that when you watch my videos, I'm going to tell you how great the world is. Unfortunately, today, it's all going to be doom and gloom. I'm going to talk about how the Western world is going to collapse, and there's nothing anyone can do about it. So, let me start with a concrete example. I live in Canada, and these past few years, I've just seen Canadian society get worse and worse. And a lot of the issue is this relentless immigration these past 5 years. Millions of people have come into this country seeking a better life. Unfortunately, they congregate in only a few cities where there are economic opportunities. And as a result, housing prices have gone up, inflation has gone up, cost of living has gone up, but wages have been stagnant or depressed because of the surge in
Here we
cheap
go.
labor. And in Toronto, if you're not making at least $100,000 a year, it's very hard to get by. And quite frankly, most are not making that kind of money, and most are struggling. So crime has gone up, homelessness has gone up, drug addiction has gone up. It's a very dire situation in Canada. Now, it's easy to blame the immigrants. And I don't think the reason are the immigrants. I myself am an immigrant, so maybe I'm biased. But I will say that we came over in about 1983, and my dad was a high school teacher in a village in Canada. My dad was a high school teacher in our village back in China. And we were really thankful for our opportunity to come to Canada, and we felt really blessed because life back in China was just terrible. It's really hard for anyone today to imagine the poverty in China back then during the Cultural Revolution. But let me give you a concrete example. 15 years ago, my dad came to visit me in Beijing when I was working as a high school administrator. And he bought an entire duffel bag, a huge duffel bag of toilet rolls, 24 toilet rolls. And the reason why is toilet paper was considered the ultimate luxury back in our village during the Cultural Revolution. And so maybe he wanted to give these toilet rolls to all his relatives and show everyone that he's made it in Canada. Well, the problem was that he had a very hard life in Canada, as most recent immigrants do. He was a dishwasher for his entire life. And as a dishwasher, working in restaurants and bars, he encountered a lot of racism and humiliation. So let me give you an example. One day, my dad and I went to a supermarket to buy some butter. We couldn't find the butter because our supermarket was just huge. So my dad, he saw a clerk wearing his uniform, his white uniform, and my dad asked him, "Sorry, sir, do you know where the butter is?" Okay? I mean, his English isn't that great though, but it was pretty easy to understand what my dad wanted. The store clerk looks at him briefly and says, "Sorry, I don't work here." Okay? So that's the sort of humiliation that my dad faced every day as a new immigrant in Canada who didn't have any status and whose English wasn't very good. We were very poor in Canada. We could easily qualify for welfare, but we didn't apply for welfare because we didn't know welfare existed. I remember late at night, my dad would sneak out across the street and pick up some sofas or chairs that the neighbors had discarded, and they would become our furniture. My dad cut my hair. So believe it or not, but when I was younger, my hair was actually worse than it is today. And so the kids made fun of me. I had bad hair, uneven hair. My mom bought me clothes from bargain outlets, so they were crappy clothes. They weren't Nike or Adidas that the other kids were wearing. And I smelled bad. So understandably, the other kids teased me. I was very unpopular. So I focused on school. I focused on getting out of poverty. And through hard work, I went to Yale University on a full scholarship. And that opened new doors, new vistas for me. And so I really achieved the Canadian dream. And if it weren't for Canada, if it weren't for Yale, I wouldn't be able to make YouTube videos. So I'm very thankful for Canada and for Yale. So again, we're really thankful for the opportunity to come. But the reality is, there's just too many immigrants coming into this country. And what's really happening is, even though you may have some short-term economic GDP burst, ultimately you're degrading the social capital, trust, and cohesion of Canada. Ultimately, the Canadian identity has always been fragile. And all this massive influx of immigrants is making the identity much more fragile, which is in the long term going to affect Canada's capacity to work together, to innovate, to be resilient, to be cohesive as a society. Right now, a quarter, 25% of Canadians are foreign-born, first-generation immigrants like myself. So if there were ever a referendum
So
and
many options.
Canadians could choose whether or not to join the United States voluntarily, most of these immigrants would immediately say, let's join the United States because there are more economic opportunities. So in the long term, I don't see Canada staying together. I think Canada will ultimately be dismembered by the United States and be absorbed into the American empire in the next 20, 30 years. I don't think Canada right now can be a sustainable nation. Now, it's really easy to blame immigrants for all of this. And most Canadians do, in fact, blame immigrants because that's what they encounter every day. They encounter immigrants not being able to speak English, not following the rules, cutting in line. They watch the news and see immigrants committing crimes. They see immigrants, rich immigrants, buying up these expensive property and making life miserable for everyone. So it's really easy to blame the immigrants. But ultimately, we need to understand why this immigration is happening. And it's happening because of the baby boomers. The baby boomers want three things. They want their pensions to be paid. They want quality, free healthcare, and they want the property prices to go up. Basically, they want the Canadian economy to keep on growing and growing and growing, regardless of the consequences. Now, in order for the economy to grow, there are three main mechanisms to accomplish this. The first mechanism is to exploit resources, because Canada really is the wealthiest country in the world. It has abundant, almost infinite resources, especially fresh water, which is what the world is going to need in the next 100 years. So Canada's extremely wealthy place, and it can choose to exploit and export a lot of these resources. Okay, that's the first solution. The second solution, which is much more sustainable, is to unleash the entrepreneurial energy of the Canadian people to encourage more entrepreneurship, more privatization, to reduce the regulatory state, to reduce the red tape. Okay, that's the second solution. And the third solution is immigration. Let's let in more immigrants. Let's let in the rich immigrants to pour cash into the economy. Let's let in poor immigrants so that they work as slave labor for Canadian corporations. So of these three solutions, the Canadian government went with the third solution: increase immigration. Now, a lot of people out there believe that this is a conspiracy, that there's this global international conspiracy out there to dilute national identity, to destroy the idea of the nation state, to reduce the white gene pool. This is all a World Economic Forum white replacement theory conspiracy spearheaded by the Jews. And quite honestly, if the people in charge were this smart, were this well organized, the world wouldn't be in the mess that it is today. You'd be surprised by how idiotic, by how incompetent the people in charge are. So let me explain to you why immigration is increasing, not just in Canada, but also throughout the Western world.
My hand
Okay,
is too
so to understand this, we need to understand the framework of the Canadian nation. What does Canada exist and what does Canada do? Well, Canada has some certain unique characteristics. First of all, it's a vast nation with almost infinite wealth, surrounded by two oceans, the Pacific and the Atlantic. And so Canada does not have like natural predators as they would in Europe. Canadians grew up in a time of relative peace, safety, and security. The problem, though, is that Canada shares a border with the world's most powerful empire, with history's greatest empire, America. And so, in order to prevent conflict between Canada and the United States, the last major conflict between Canada and the United States was the War of 1812. To prevent the conflict, there's almost an implicit agreement between the people of Canada and the people of America. Canadians, first and foremost, are not ambitious. If Canadians were ambitious, then Canada would be at war with America, and America would have absorbed Canada into the American empire a long time ago. So Canadians, the core characteristic of the Canadian identity is lack of ambition in order to maintain peace and stability with America. And if you're not ambitious, then you're not going to industrialize, which means that you're going to maintain and safeguard the environment. You'll use some of the environment, but you'll make sure it's self-sustaining. So in other words, Canada is almost like a resource bank for the American empire. The American empire, when it needs, can always draw on the infinite resources of Canada. And so, because of its lack of ambition, there are two main drivers of the Canadian economy. The first, as I said, is resource exploitation, but sustainable, limited resource exploitation. But the main driver of the Canadian economy is immigration. Canada allows rich, corrupt families to come to Canada to hide their wealth. Canada also welcomes cheap labor, poor immigrants like my father, to come to Canada to do all the work, so that Canadians can enjoy their life on drinking beer, drinking Molson's, a terrible beer by the way, by the cottage. And because of this economic framework, three major religions have developed in Canada to sustain this economic framework. The first religion is environmentalism. So Canadians love the environment. They believe it is their duty, their inherent duty, to protect and love trees. That's the first religion. Second religion is multiculturalism. The belief that diversity is good, mainly because white people love ethnic food. When white people think multiculturalism, they think ethnic restaurants, Mexican food, Chinatown, and so they love multiculturalism. But if immigrants become politically ambitious like the Indians, no, you can't have that. So that's why Indians are so derided in Canada, because the Indians are actually politically active and effective. And if but hey, if the Indians stick to making samosas every day, Canadians would love them. So in a multicultural society, what's really important is to be an open society and not have a distinct cultural identity. And this has created a lot of problems in Canada. It'll create further problems in Canada. And the third major religion is bureaucratism, right? Because if you don't have your own ethnic identity, if you don't have a core ambition, then you need a regulatory state, a bureaucracy, in order to maintain everything together. You need people to tell you what to do. And Canadians worship authority. Canadians are extremely obedient. Canadians believe experts know everything. Okay? So because of these three religions, there are three distinct characteristics about the Canadian individual. Okay? What are Canadians really good at? Well, the first thing is Canadians are really good at following the rules. From birth, Canadians believe that they must obey the rules. The worst thing that can happen is if they break a rule. Second thing that Canadians really are really good at is being polite to other people, because in a multicultural society, you don't want to offend everyone. But I will say that I have noticed in my most recent trip back to Canada, Canadians are no longer so polite. They're much more passive-aggressive than before because of the dire economic situation that Canada is in right now. And the third thing that Canadians are really good at, in fact, probably the best in the world at, is being mediocre. Okay? Canadians absolutely have no ambition. In fact, they hate ambition. I remember in high school, because I was poor and I wanted to go to Yale, I was extremely focused on grades. And so my teachers, the word they used for me is ambitious. I'm an ambitious individual. And that's essentially a curse word in Canada. But I will say this. Canada, I mean, if you can just conceptualize heaven on earth, it would be Canada, right? Extreme wealth, extremely generous government benefits. No one will go poor. No one will starve in Canada. No wars, just complete peace. It's almost heaven on earth. And here is an opportunity for people to achieve eudaimonia, right? Eudaimonia is the Greek term for flourishing. Here is opportunity for Canadians to contribute intellectually to the development of humanity, because they have the resources, they have the time, they have the security. No one else does. And so you would expect this tremendous outpouring of human creativity in Canada these past 50 years. In reality, Canadians have, for the past 50 years, chosen to shut off their brains. Okay? Canada is an extremely complacent nation. It's almost like everyone's on Prozac or something. This is Prozac Nation. So Canadians are extremely mediocre. I think that after Canada becomes dismembered and joins the American Empire, maybe a generation afterwards, everyone's going to forget Canada ever existed, because Canada has made absolutely no contribution to the world. Canada doesn't really matter in the world, and Canadians are very happy to not matter in the world. So now we can understand, if your three religions are environmentalism, multiculturalism, and bureaucratism, well, then there's only one solution for you, right? Because you can't exploit resources because of your religion of environmentalism. You can't encourage entrepreneurship because of your religion of bureaucratism, right? You don't want to reduce the regulatory state. You don't want to promote individual initiative. So the only solution available to you is mass immigration. Okay? And again, a lot of it is just driven by the baby boomers. So now let me explain to you why baby boomers suck. And they suck for three main reasons. The first is that they're the most selfish generation in human history. Second is that they're going to be the longest living generation in human history. And the third is that they want to maintain the empire. All right, so let me go through each one by one. Baby boomers are selfish. Everyone knows this. They had the most luxurious life. But the problem is that if you always live a life of comfort and security and prosperity, you become a selfish individual because you think you deserve all this. Okay? The other thing is that the baby boomers have a religion, and it's an achievement. It's an ethos of achievement and accumulation. The more, the better. The bigger, the better. The more money I have, the better. The longer I live, the better. I need to accumulate and accumulate and achieve in order to signify my value, my worth. And their greed, their selfishness is destroying the environment, it's destroying the economy, and ultimately it's going to kill their children. Okay, so that's the first thing. Baby boomers are extremely selfish. And that by itself is not really a problem. The problem is they're not dying. And I can understand why, okay? Because at home, I'm living with my dad. And my dad is in his early 80s. And as I said previously, he's had this terrible life. 10 years ago, he got diagnosed with Parkinson's. 5 years ago, he had a bad fall while using the bathroom, and now he's paralyzed. And we really thought 5 years ago that was it. He had a few months to live, but he's still going. And so he has Parkinson's. He's basically paralyzed, and he's living his best life. All his life, he's worked slave wages, minimum wage, and now he's collecting a very generous pension from the Canadian government. It's free money for him. He has access to the best health care. Honestly, if we had to pay for the health care, we couldn't afford it, and he would have died 5 years ago. But now, because it's all being paid by the Canadian government, he spent 6 months at a really nice hospital with his own room. Every day, a physical therapist comes to the house and helps him regain some muscle control, and does some cleaning for him. And really, it's his best life. And in his house, he has his own house. And because of all this immigration, he's seeing the property value go up. He's seeing himself getting wealthier and wealthier. If you're a baby boomer who's been taught that what matters is achievement and accumulation, why would you give up now, right? As your life gets to get better and better, why would you give it up now? So even though, he's bedridden all the time, I see him clinging to life. And I can understand why, because he's been through so much crap, and now he can really begin to enjoy himself. This is really heaven on earth for him. So he doesn't want to die. Okay? But it's not just him, it's the entire generation of baby boomers. Millions and millions of them. And in Canada, they're a quarter of the population. So they control all the political power, they control all the wealth, and therefore they can dictate government policy. I have a friend in New York City, a very famous person, extremely wealthy, like tens of millions of dollars. And she's 90, and she has Alzheimer's, and she can't walk. Most of the time, she's sleeping. She's semi-comatose, basically. And I thought, any day now she could die, but I've been thinking that for the past 10 years. And one day I asked my cousin, who's a doctor, listen, if you're 9 years old and you're senile, you have Alzheimer's, you can't get out of bed, but you have unlimited wealth, how long can modern medicine keep you going? Like, how long can you survive? And she has like 4 full-time caregivers to make sure that, you know, she's taken care of. And my cousin, the doctor, said to me, she can go on for like 20 years at least. Another 20 years at least. So these baby boomers aren't dying, okay? So the baby boomers have captured all the wealth of society, and they refuse to share any of it because of their achievement ethos, and they're not dying. So, but then there's actually a much bigger problem, which is that baby boomers are wedded to the idea of empire. Last year, I was in Brooklyn, visiting some friends. I got invited to a party, and this party was full of China experts. So apparently, every China expert in the world is from Brooklyn. So after COVID, when they were forced out of China, they all returned to Brooklyn, and so I met all of them at this party. And I was talking to one lady, very wealthy, comes from a very powerful family, and and she was a baby boomer, and I discussed with her. We were talking individually, one-on-one. I said to her privately my fears about the American political system. I said my fear is that given the trajectory of American foreign policy, which is like extremely non-existent, I said there's a danger that America could be fighting wars on 3 major fronts. America could be fighting simultaneously Russia, Iran, and China. And then she looked at me and said, that's fine. We're America. We're the indispensable nation. We can do this. We can take on all 3 and defeat all 3. Does not matter. Okay? That's the arrogance of empire. All right, so let me give you an image of what empire is. And for this image, I'm going to draw on the play The Bacchae from Euripides. If you have not read Euripides, you must read Euripides, one of the greatest playwrights in human history. So he wrote the play The Bacchae about the year 400 BCE. And this is like after the Peloponnesian War, when Athens, the Athenian Empire, which had become basically a mafia state, basically decided to go to war against the entire world, and thousands and thousands of the young people died in these wars of empire. And so Euripides wrote the Bacchae almost as a critique of empire. And so the ending of the Bacchae goes like this. There's a religious festival in the mountains, and these women are all drugged out, okay? They're hallucinating. And as part of the religious festival, they sacrifice a man who's the king of Thebes, Pentheus. And so what they do is they capture him, they rip him apart, okay? They physically rip him apart. They rip up the limbs, they rip up the legs, they dismember him. And the person who rips off his head is actually his mother, Agave. And after she does this, she becomes ecstatic. And she takes the head and she runs back to the city of Thebes, and she proclaims to the citizens, look at what I've done. And she's holding the head of her son, Pentheus, in her right hand. And she's saying to everyone, this is a lion's head. You see how brave, you see how powerful, you see how virtuous I am for fighting a lion and ripping his head off. And then everyone looks at her aghast. They don't believe that she can't see the truth. And so finally her father, Cadmus, has to tell her, Agave, that's not a lion's head. That's the head of your son. So that's what an empire is, okay? If you want to know what an empire is, remember the image of a mother holding the head of her son and proclaiming to the world, look how brave, powerful, and virtuous I am. An empire is a system where the old sacrifice the young for their glory. Okay? That's what an empire is. And that's what the baby boomers want. They grew up in a time of the Pax Americana. They don't want to see it die in their lifetimes. They rather burn down the entire empire. They rather sacrifice their own children and their grandchildren than to lose the idea of empire while they're alive. Okay, so that's why the baby boomers have basically for the American government to launch wars around the world to save the Pax Americana, because that's the system they grew up in. That's a system they want to die in. The Pax Americana, the Anglo-American Empire. They want to feel virtuous, powerful, and strong. Okay, and they don't care if they have to burn down the world in order to do so. And so the question then is, what can we do? Well, you think about it, there's nothing we can do, because as I said, the baby boomers are the most dominant political group in the Western world. They control the political system. They control the financial system. They can control the cultural system. And they're our parents. They're the people we love and honor and cherish. I'm not gonna say to my father, hey dad, you're paralyzed, your life doesn't have any meaning anymore, and maybe it's time for you to rest in peace, and so that the rest of the world, the young, can have their place. So one metaphor that I think best describes the world we live in is rat utopia. Rat utopia are a series of experiments conducted by James B. Calhoun in the 60s and 70s. And this was a time of growing abundance in the world. And this is the first time in human history when we escaped scarcity, the problem of scarcity. So we want to look at what would happen if we lived in a world of abundance. So we created these experiments, these colonies, where rats were allowed to live in a world of abundance. There were no predators, there was unlimited water and food. And what happened each time we did this experiment, no matter how he put the experiment, the result was the same. What happened was the social hierarchies that governed the rat colony collapsed. And Calhoun calls this the behavior sink. And very quickly, the rats start to cannibalize each other. They start to engage in all sorts of brutal activities. As a result, everyone died out. Okay? So no matter how James B. Calhoun constructed this experiment, ultimately it led to the collapse of the rat colony and the extermination of all the rats. And he struggled with this all his life, and he never really find the answer as to why this was happening. And the only thing that he could hypothesize is maybe water can be infinite. Maybe security, food, luxury, maybe all can be provided infinitely. One thing that is not infinite, one thing that is a zero-sum game is the idea of status. And we are ingrained, the desire for status is inherent. We strive for status. So normally in the state of nature, rats will fight each other for status. And the rats who lose, they'll run off somewhere else and they'll build their own colony, or they'll get killed by natural predators. But in an enclosed environment where the rats can't run off somewhere else, then they're forced to constantly fight each other over and over again for status. Peter Turchin, the social scientist, has a concept for this. It's called elite overproduction. Societies collapse over time because too much elite is being produced, and ultimately they will fight each other for the limited positions of power and status. And so we're living in rat utopia. And quite honestly, this is why young people now refuse to have children. It's not just because the economic opportunities for young people are very limited, are very pessimistic, and they are. The real reason is the baby boomers refuse to give up their status. Think about the politicians in Washington, D.C. I mean, like, many of them, their brains aren't even functioning, and they're still there. And so we live in a time of rat utopia. But again, these people are the ones who gave us birth. They're the ones who nurtured us. They're the ones who we must honor and cherish. So we can never ever blame the baby boomers for what's going on. We blame the immigrants, or we blame the Jews, or we blame the deep state, or we blame Trump, or we blame President Trudeau. We never blame the real culprits for the baby boomers. Okay, so the question then is, what can we do? And so I think the only thing we can do is tell the truth. We owe it to ourselves, we owe it to our children to let them know the truth. It was not the immigrants who destroyed the West. It was not Putin or Trump or Trudeau who destroyed the West. It was not the Jews. It was us. Because we became selfish, lazy, and corrupt. That's the real reason why the West is dying, and the real reason why no one can do anything about it. Okay? Because we refuse to admit the truth to ourselves. But the least we can do is tell the truth to our children, and that's why I do what I do. Okay, so again, apologies for today. I'm sorry for such doom and gloom. Next week we go back to the regular programming of just cheer. Okay. No, I'm not going to ever be optimistic about the world because there's no reason to be optimistic about the world. Okay, so next week, I'm going to preview the next academic year of classes I'll be teaching. I'll be teaching 3 new classes, the secret history of the world. So I'll be going into the nexus of finance, intelligence, and religion. It's going to be a really interesting class. I'm really looking forward to teaching it. I'm really looking forward to sharing with you. I'll also be teaching the great books, and I'll also be teaching game theory. Okay, so in my next video next week, I'll be sharing with you, preview these 3 classes. If you like what I do, please support my work by supporting me on Buy Me a Coffee. The link is below. If you want to be part of my community, the Predictive History community, please join my Discord server. This week, I've started a Substack. And if you want to join my Substack, the link is below as well. So in my Substack, I'll be going into solutions for how we can rebuild a better world, how we can work together to build a better world after the world collapses. Okay, that's it for today. I'll see you guys next week. Thank you so much for today, and I look forward to next week.
Hail, friend.
I see you've brought guests.
So many options. I must choose soon.
Don't let the door hit you.
A tango?
Observe, analyze, engage.
A tango?
Tender flesh for the dragon lord. I take this. Oh, and that.
I wonder.
Starlight. On wings of evil.
New Eden.
We're going on a dangerous voyage. You in?
I've been working on this topic for a while now. It's not something new to me by any means. The topic, oh wait, before I jump into it, did you have like t-shirts and stuff? Okay, so the Austin School does have t-shirts. They are available. Kelsey has them. Yeah. So the front is cool, but the back is better. So that's the front, but the back, I don't know what to make of this, but I just don't know. Anyway, so this is the back. You kind of need to have one of these, I'm pretty sure. We're using it to fundraise for the Austin School, so it goes to a terrible cause. $18. All right, so back to the topic at hand. One of the things that I've often wondered about is how do these categories come into being? I was actually talking about this earlier, but just as an example, I had a student about a year ago who was black, and by black I don't mean like he was African American. He actually had to put white when he filled out race because he was from North Africa. But I mean, he was black, like his skin was black. When you see him in the street, you're gonna go, look, there's a black guy. You're not gonna go, oh my God, look at that white guy who looks very dark. But when it came time to bubble in race, he had to put in white, right? So like, how the hell did we get that category? Clearly this is a category that's arbitrary at some level. There was a rule made And then we just take people and we jam them into these categories. And one of the categories that's always struck me as sort of odd was this East-West category that we have. So if you were here on Thursday, I took this on a little bit and I talked about how that category formed in terms and why it mattered in terms of foreign relations. But I'm going to take this thing even further back and dig into it a little bit deeper, because that's pretty much all this is about. So even though this talk is a brief history of Western civilization, to do that, there has to be an East, right, to compare it to, because you can't really understand what the West is unless you have an other to look at. And then you say, oh, really what the West is not that, right? Usually when you define something by what it is, you really don't know what you're talking about. But when you define it by what it's not, it brings it into light a little bit. So I want to take this thing and also look at the very notion of the idea of the word civilization. So we're going to do the East-West divide, but we're also going to do civilization versus non-civilization. Historians have traditionally, I'm going to start with civilization, and historians have traditionally defined civilization as starting with the advent of writing. Now the reason historians have picked writing is it's actually really simple. It's that all a historian really is at the end of the day is a person who does nonfiction literature, right? The difference between the history department and the English department is that the historian is doing nonfiction and the English department's doing fiction. That's the primary difference between the two. Because at the end of the day, all a historian is doing is reading historical texts and maybe trying to put them to memory, and then trying to create a narrative based on what they've read. Because at the end of the day, there are lots of holes when you read history. There's lots of gaps, so you have to fill them in. So you're kind of constructing a fictional story to fill in the gaps for the non-fictional parts that you know. And so when a historian says, oh, this is what I think happened, what they're really saying is, we really don't know what happened, but based on the bits that we do know, this is the narrative I've come up with. If you make history go back to the advent of writing, then history is roughly 5,100 years old now, and at the same time that makes civilization 5,100 years old, right? If you couple the two together. So history and civilization are co-defined. Having said that, I, as a political scientist, don't like that. So I love history. I do history. When I was teaching for the University of Maryland, University College, I was in their history department. I consider myself to be at least somewhat of a historian. So I'm not saying this to bash on history. I just think it's really arbitrary. Because as a political scientist, one of the questions I ask is, why did writing even come into being? And it looks like the reason writing came into being was that there was a state, and in this case, the state in Sumer, but also there was a state in Egypt, and these two states had a problem, and that was they had a certain amount of cattle, they had a certain amount of grain, they had a certain amount of fruit, they had wine, they had beer, and they needed to, horses, sheep, whatever they had, they didn't have horses. Delete horses, but sheep, right? Whatever they had, horses came later. And they needed to actually categorize and keep track of what they had. They needed to be able to take the resources and pool them. They needed to be able to distribute their resources.
Incredible.
To do that, they needed some way of writing down what they had. To do that, they needed numbers and they needed letters, right? Or characters. So in Sumer and in Egypt, a character system formed. The problem with the character system is right away you get into this trouble of, what if we get into a new concept and then we have a word, but we don't have a character for it? So the Egyptians also began doing phonetic letters. So there's this kind of misconception that the first phonetic alphabet ever was the Phoenician alphabet, hence phonetic, Phoenician. But really, actually, it was the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs that were the first phonetic alphabet. It's just that at the same time, they also used characters. So they did both. In any case, it means government came before writing, right? Because government made writing happen out of necessity. So then my next question is, well, when did government come into being? We think now that it was somewhere around 6,500 years ago, or 4,000 years ago.
What's up, everyone? Tyrese Halliburton here to talk about the all-new motion engine in NBA 2K26. This year, Pro Play powers the dynamic motion engine, making your actions feel more lifelike and realistic. Experience more exact positioning when closing out on the perimeter, stopping on the dive after driving to the basket, and lateral movement when planting your feet. This is the biggest change to player movement since NBA 2K21 when I entered the league, offering a fresh and authentic feeling every time you step on the court.
500 BC in Egypt. Egypt did it first, we think, and then Mesopotamia did it shortly after. So Mesopotamia beat Egypt to writing, but Egypt beat Mesopotamia to government. The two kind of did things in tandem. One would do one, and then the other one would catch up shortly afterwards. The reason that the government came into being, again, was probably out of necessity. In the case of Egypt, it was probably tied to the flood cycle. So Egypt doesn't get much rain, annual rain. They have instead these annual floods. What happens is it snows in Central Africa. It snows in Equatorial Africa. Right? Just the sentence doesn't fit, right? Just what the heck? And then the snows melt, and then they flood and create the Nile flood, the annual Nile floods, and that's what created this cycle in Egypt that made Egypt this incredibly fertile place. Per acre, Egypt is probably the most fertile place on earth when you're in the Nile Valley. And what that did was, that made it so Egypt could produce crazy amounts of food with almost no effort, without worrying about burning out their soil. The problem is weather, and sometimes weather cooperates, and sometimes weather goes haywire, and they were susceptible to droughts, and as a result, there was the possibility of famine. But also the other was true. They could get a flood that lasted too long, and it caused the crops to rot in the field, and so they had to constantly worry about the weather. Here's the thing, if they could pool their resources together, they could build granaries. And then in the granaries, they could store the grain. So what probably created the first government in Egypt was they probably went through this terrible famine event. You know, a significant portion of the population died. And then the next harvest, they're bringing in the grain, and they're like, wow, we're leaving a lot of this grain here in the field to rot because we can just casually produce so much food. Wouldn't it be cool if this grain was around the next time there was a famine? And then somebody probably had the brilliant idea, oh my God, let's create a granary, and tried to talk everybody into it. In the act of talking everybody into it, they as a community got together, made the decision to do this, they pooled their resources, they made the granary. The problem is the granary requires upkeep. So once they initially got together and made the decision to make the granary, now they have to make the decision to allocate the resources to sustaining the granary. And in that moment, government probably formed. But then there's this problem that humanity always suffers from. You know what the right thing to do is, but you're motivated by emotions, by addiction, by laziness, by habit, by desire, and you'll do the wrong thing anyway. Right? So even after they got the granary up and running, and even after they've allocated the resources to sustain the granary, there is this propensity of humans to go, geez, I should really bring that grain this year. What if I don't? I'm going to take the year off. And then, the next year comes along and you don't bring it again. There's no consequence. The next year comes along and you don't bring it again. But then little by little, more and more people bring less and less grain because we're forgetting the memory, the horror of the famine kind of fades. Next thing you know, it's the next generation. They didn't experience it, so they don't know what you're talking about when you go, yeah, it was a bad famine. You should really put grain in that granary. And then the next famine hits, and there's no grain. And people die in really large numbers, and they're like, wow, our ancestors built this granary, and we didn't do upkeep. How do we do this? And at some point, somebody must have had this idea. And it's kind of a fascinating idea when you think about it. And that was to lie, to manipulate, to twist the truth. Because they realized that the rational brain wasn't enough to motivate people to do the right thing. But if you just walked up to a person and said to them, you should do the following because of A, B, C, D, you should drive a smaller car because it's better for the environment. And then next time I see you, you're in an SUV touring around with absolutely no passengers and never off-roading. So no one knows why you have an SUV. Right? Because we're not rational beings. Humans have never been rational beings. All the science shows humans aren't rational beings. You just put that aside. We are rationalizing beings. Right? We make a decision and then afterwards we try to create a story to make what we did not seem completely insane to the people we're going to have to explain this to later. And you were taught to do that probably by your mother. Every time you did something really stupid, she'd go, "Why'd you do that?" You know, "I don't know." "You better come up with a reason," and then sends you off to your room. So now you're like, shit, what is my reason? What is my reason? I have to anticipate the next time I get into trouble for doing something stupid. So when you come home with that giant red SUV, right, and all your friends are like, "What'd you get that for? You don't even have family or go off-road." You're like, "Well, I just really like the idea of being paralyzed in a car accident, and I heard you're 6 times more likely to be paralyzed in an SUV than in a regular car. And so that's what I'm going for." And people are like, "Oh, okay." So I've got this problem. If I lay it out to you and I say, "Look, you really need to bring the grain because there's going to be a famine and we're all going to die," we know you won't bring the damn grain because humans don't work that way. But what if I told you this? If you bring the grain, I had a dream last night, and in it the god Amun came to me, and he said he would reward people who brought the grain and punish people who didn't. You bring the grain, the drought happens, next thing you know, the priest is doling out the grain.
Ready for another round?
That's right, we just invented the priesthood. A group of people who had direct contact with the god. You didn't bring the grain, the drought happens, and the next thing you know, the priest is like, "Guess what, guys? Some of us are going to starve to death." In other words, no matter what happens, that priest looks prescient. That priest looks like they can look into the future. Now your incentive to bring the grain is to establish a closer link to your best imaginary friend, right? It's so that you can have this direct link with, in this case, the god Amun. So it turns out that the advent of government probably was totally tied to an economic situation and also a religious situation where the goal was, by a community or an individual, to intentionally manipulate your economic behavior using religion, using a normative method for manipulating your behavior, to create some desired economic outcome. In this case, a giant insurance policy, a giant community-wide insurance policy, so that the next time the weather went to shit, we didn't all starve. So that's what I used to think would be an amazing marker for the start of civilization. And then we started making some really unusual discoveries. So let me just clarify that the reason I had picked that period, 6,500 years ago, was in part based on a bias that I had. The bias was that human beings didn't do anything worth noting until we started doing agriculture. That agriculture was sort of this major change, this major shift in our way of being. Now, not that agriculture was necessarily a good thing.
The Ariel is slain.
I did it!
So if you looked at what gathering and hunting societies did before agriculture, they moved from location to location, especially once they started to put too much pressure on the local environments, right? You've eaten too many mongongo nuts. It's time to move so that there's enough mongongo nuts left to create the next generation of mongongo trees, right? That's the goal. The goal for a gatherer and hunter is to have no impact on the environment. We've killed a bunch of gazelles here. We've killed just as many as we can to not affect the size of the herd next year. It's time to move and find a new source for food. That's your goal. We've been at this watering hole just long enough that we've put too much pressure or just enough pressure on it. It's time to move and find another watering hole, right? Your goal is to have no impact. The gathering and hunting culture that has an impact breaks their ecosystem and they starve to death the next year, right? But in that system, you don't own anything. You're migratory because you move from place to place, tapping into seasonal foods, but also avoiding overtaxing whatever specific food that it is that you rely upon. Agriculture doesn't happen because we invent it and we go, oh my God, this is better. Because think about it, in gathering and hunting, you have a wide variety of foods. One of the problems with the modern diet, right, is that a lot of people, especially in the United States, just keep eating the same food over and over and over again. That can lead to food allergies, for one thing. One of the reasons why we've seen an increase in the number of people who are gluten intolerant is we basically have a monoculture when it comes to wheat. If you were to look at how we planted wheat fields just 200 years ago, there were probably 100 different strains of wheat. So when you ate wheat, you weren't eating the same wheat every single time. But also, you ate other things other than wheat. You had some barley in the mix, right? You had a variety of foods. But a gatherer and hunter, like you're eating berries for part of the year, and you're eating tubers another part of the year, and next thing you know, you're eating legumes, and then you have this steady source of meat coming into your diet. So there's a little bit of deer, a little bit of rabbit, a little bit of giraffe, whatever happens to be available and in the proper quantities, right? That makes for a really healthy diet. If you just ate macaroni and cheese every day for like 4 years, maybe supplement it with ramen or something, you will die of malnutrition. Like it will kill you. You can't, at some point you're going to need to eat like something from the broccoli family or something, you know? I know it's actually the cabbage family. It's just funnier to say it. Especially because, have you noticed all the weird broccolis? Like, what's with that purple? What did they do? Like, was it fish DNA they spliced in there to get it to turn purple? Like, I want to know what weird DNA they put in that plant to get it to flip. There was an experiment at one point with putting fish DNA into strawberries to keep them from freezing in the winter. These strawberries taste funny. When we started doing agriculture, it wasn't because we wanted to. We did it kicking and screaming. So the ancient Egyptians the prehistoric Egyptians probably began doing agriculture about 11,000 years ago. They weren't the first, right? The Mesopotamians beat the Egyptians by 7 or so centuries. But the Egyptians started doing it about 11,000 years ago. By about 5,000 years ago, so over a 6,000 year span of time, they went from 0% dependent on agriculture to about 60% dependent on agriculture. In other words, it took them 6,000 years to get 60% dependent on agriculture. 6,000 years, that's a remarkably long chunk of time. Talk about incremental. Right? They were doing it so slowly. It took millennia. And the reason is this. It is true that per acre, you can get more calories out of your soil with agriculture. Right? So if I have 40 acres and I'm doing agriculture, I can sustain myself on it. But to do gathering and hunting, I probably need 400 acres. So as population densities increase, they reach this point where we are forced to do agriculture. We actually think there was a shock event that caused the straw to break the camel's back, so to speak. What had happened was Europe had an event called the Younger Dryas. It was a miniature ice age, which is always cool. Who doesn't like those? What had happened was the Laurentian ice sheet melted, and we now think quite catastrophically. For years, we just assumed it took hundreds of years for the Laurentian ice sheet to melt. The Laurentian ice sheet was massive. It was the size of a really large country. It probably covered about 20% of the United States and about 20% of Canada. So it was this really massive chunk of ice sitting on top of what is today the Great Lakes. And we now there are some people who suspect it may have melted in as short a period as 8 years. And it's why there's the St. Lawrence River. All that fresh water suddenly had to go somewhere, and it literally cut a straight line to the Atlantic Ocean in the form of the St. Lawrence River. And when it did that, all that fresh water catastrophically ended up in the North Atlantic. Now there's a giant underwater river in the Atlantic of hot water, and it flows from the equator to the North Atlantic, and it surfaces pretty close to Iceland. And when it surfaces, it heats the atmosphere. So think about this. Cairo, Egypt, is right about north-south, right about where Austin is. We're on the same, we're about as far north as Cairo, Egypt is. Rome, Italy, is about as far north as New York City. When I think of Rome, I don't think of a city anywhere near as cold as New York City, right? Berlin is about where Winnipeg, Canada, is. Stockholm is about where Anchorage, Alaska is. Europe is remarkably warmer than North America because of this hot water current that comes to the surface in the North Atlantic, and it makes Europe this pretty balmy, fun place to be in. And all of a sudden, all that cold water from the Laurentian ice sheet, catastrophic melt, dumps into the North Atlantic. It turned off that hot water current and froze Europe. It just froze it. Massive ice sheet formed over the top of Scandinavia and Britain, and the population of people that were living there literally had to run south. And we now know because of genetics has become so fun, that the men in Europe abandoned the place and poured into what is today Iraq. And probably there was so many that it forced the population in Iraq to adapt. They had to increase the caloric output of the land they were using. And so they had to switch from gathering and hunting to agriculture to sustain this massive refugee problem of Europeans pouring into Syria and Iraq. How obnoxious. The really crazy thing is, it resulted in the world's, probably one of the world's first ever cities, and it was a really large city because the women who got left behind by those deadbeat dads had to figure out how to survive. And historically, most cultures, most gathering and hunting cultures, the men do the hunting, the women do the gathering. You're in the middle of an ice age, there aren't a lot of plants to gather. So all of a sudden, the women that were left behind had to switch over to hunting because that was the only food available, right? They needed to switch over to meat. And so they, instead of remaining scattered, they actually went into what is today the Czech Republic, and they founded a large town, and they began working together in this cooperative to help each other hunt so that they could raise their families in this massive cooperative. Eventually, though, and this is centuries later, men start to migrate back out of the Middle East and into Europe. And so if you're a European, this is fun, you're genetically, you have a huge genetic stock that's down your mother's line that's actually native European, and then your father's line is probably mostly Mesopotamian, just to make things really confusing. Anyway, it's not part of your identity, but it's better that you know the truth. So you know that whom you hate is yourself. It just makes you more honest. Keep hating yourself, that's fine. Whatever it takes to wake up in the morning. I prefer hot tea. It's okay. That's when it works. Well, that's what works for you, you know what I mean? Like, you gotta be a productive member of society. Figure out how. I'm telling you all of this because I want to blow up this agriculture thing a little bit. First of all, agriculture sucked once people started doing it. It meant you couldn't keep moving, and it meant you now had a monoculture. Instead of eating a little bit of this and eating a little bit of that, and eating a little bit of this like we do today with the grocery store, right? The grocery store has created the gathering and hunting environment. You can walk in, oh, that looks good, in cart. Oh, look at that. It's like it's like in our hearts, we just want to be gatherers and hunters, so we made the grocery store. But before the grocery store, before we had this luxurious, convenient, crazy, opulent grocery store experience, and you're doing agriculture, what are we having for breakfast, hon? I was thinking about cracked wheat for breakfast, and then maybe with some beer. Oh, what's for lunch? How about some bread and some beer? Ooh, cool. What's for dinner? How about wheat soup and beer? All right, you're gonna eat a lot of whatever you're growing because that's what you have available. So there goes your dietary variety. Not only is it probably boring and makes you suicidal, but it's also really unhealthy for you. To make things worse, the number one way we processed wheat was we would grind the wheat between two stones. Well, then we would make bread out of it. So we just basically gave you sandpaper, and then you chew on that because the two stones are grinding together. It's not just the two stones are grinding the wheat in between them. And so by the time you're done, there's little fine particles of dust in your bread, and you eat that, it takes the enamel off your teeth. And, right, bread means no teeth after age 35. As if that wasn't enough, prior to that, we had medicine. Gathering and hunting societies had medicine. We now think they had acupuncture. Well, one of the reasons we know that is the Iceman. He was found in northern Italy or Switzerland, I don't remember where, but they found this guy that was frozen. He's like, 5,000, 6,000 years old, and he has these tattoo tracks all across his back. And you know, they don't make any obvious picture. It looks like a map. It looks like somebody has made this map on his back. And then somebody thought, you know what, I'm going to look at acupuncture. And it turns out they're the exact acupuncture sites you would do for a person who has a bad back and a bad digestive tract. And we know from examining him that he had stomach issues and a bad back. And so it turns out there's apparently universal truths in acupuncture, and ancient Europeans, prehistoric Europeans were even doing it. He was murdered, by the way, so it's also a crime scene investigation. Somebody stabbed him in the back, jerks. But thank God, because now we have him to examine. Not morbid, it's weird too. I think that, by the way, that's the part of Europe that...
Do you want to start building AI applications but don't know where to begin? Join the Langflow AI competition and learn by doing. With 40...
my dad's dad's family is from, so I'm sure I'm actually related to the Iceman somehow. I feel like we should just examine him a little bit more and give him the good burial that he deserves. No, let's keep him frozen. That's really cool. Switching over to agriculture also means that that piece of land that I've planted, I have to stick around and wait for it to harvest. It's not just I can't keep moving. I'm tied to that land because I got to keep Bambi and Thumper out of my farm, right? But then there's my neighbors. They're a bunch of slacker, lazy bastards. They haven't planted their own field, and they're really hungry now, and so they're coming onto my field and stealing my food. So I need to smash them in the head with a club and try and push them away from my farm field. And so we've just invented warfare. We've just invented private property. To make things worse, we're now living in these densely populated areas, or at least more densely populated areas. So if a disease breaks out, we're more likely to transmit it to each other, whereas before, if a disease broke out in the gathering and hunting band, they would just die before they had a chance to pass it on because they were so isolated from each other. So we're now having rampant diseases, no teeth, our diet sucks, our food tastes like crap, and we're doing warfare. I thought, probably most people, that's the key ingredient to starting civilization. Next thing you know, we have government and organized religion, and boom. We now think, based on a finding in 2007, that something else may be going on. The finding was in Syria, and as you know, 4 years later, there was this inconvenient little civil war. We found archaeological sites in Syria where religious monuments were built that predated agriculture by as much as maybe 3,000 years. So not predated agriculture by 20 years or 100 years or 200 years, but possibly as much as 2,000 years, 1 to 2,000 years. It's not close, right? It might as well be a million years away, actually, at that point. It means that monumental structures weren't dependent on agriculture as we had thought, that bringing people together into densely populated areas wasn't apparently as dependent on agriculture as we thought. We've since found some archaeological sites that are similar in Turkey, and we've been sort of going through the ones in Turkey, but we can't do any of the archaeology on Syria. In other words, I'm eager for the Syrian civil war to end, not just so that Syrians can stop murdering each other, but so we can send archaeologists to go in there and dig these sites up, because I have a feeling that they're going to reveal something remarkable. One of the interesting things is we found bones, and we can test bones to see what your diet was. You really are literally what you eat. And the bones confirm that these were not farmers. They were gatherer and hunters. They really were on this pre-farm diet. So it's not just, we're not just relying on carbon dating to confirm this. In any case, I just want you to know that where we peg the start of civilization and how we define what it is should be something that we question. I certainly think we need to throw out, and we need to throw it out as fast as we can, the advent of writing that's absurdity. Archaeology makes that clear, just because archaeology has told us all these other remarkable stories. Whether we peg it to government, like my original assumptions told us to do, or we peg it to the advent of organized religion, as these sites in Turkey and Syria are clearly indicating happened 14,000 years ago. I don't know. I don't know where to go with this. I just need the Syrian civil war to end so we can get more data. So that's one of the questions here. The other one is this notion of East-West. So I want to get back to that, because I find it really strange. So think about what your average history class, whether it was in high school or maybe it was Western Civ 1 or Western Civ 2 in college. Let's do Western Civ 1. So you go in, and your textbook and your professor, let's do a 16-week, let's make it a college class. It's a 16-week class. You're going to meet 32 times. And in the process, you're going to start off with Mesopotamia, right? Every textbook starts off with Mesopotamia. Why? Because 5,100 years ago, they started writing. Okay. And your professor probably spends one day on Mesopotamia, maybe two. And next thing you know, you're doing Egypt. And you spend 1, maybe 2 days on Egypt. The next thing you know, you're doing the Greeks, and you're spending 5 weeks on the Greeks. And before you know it, you're doing the Romans, and you're spending like 8 weeks on the Romans. And at this point, you probably have a week left after you take all the tests out. And you jump into the medieval period and quickly say it was terrible, the peasants suffered. Done. Western Civ 1 out of the way. Western Civ 2 miraculously starts in the year 1300. And it's basically, you know, Plutarch and Galileo, and we have skyscrapers, and it's done. We're on the moon. It's great. It's great. Here's where I get lost. So, and you start figuring this out, probably. We want to talk about your starting point a little bit more. I mean, when you start something, isn't the starting moment kind of one of the most important moments? Because doesn't it frame every single thing you will do afterwards? That 1 or 2 class periods on Mesopotamia and the 1 or 2 class periods on Egypt doesn't quite seem like it's enough. Because listen what the textbook and the professor are admitting. Egypt and Mesopotamia founded Western civilization. Even if you say, no, it happened in Syria, right? Part of Syria is in Mesopotamia, and the rest of Syria is immediately adjacent to Mesopotamia. So clearly, the foundational moment for Western civilization has at least something to do with what is today Iraq and Syria. On top of it all, we know that around 11,700 years ago, Iraq did agriculture before anybody else. So even if you buy the thing that I'm asking you a question, that agriculture was a key component to starting civilization, it's still Iraq. But then if you do what I do, and you go, no, it's government, although I'm questioning this, then it's Egypt, and then Iraq, because they did it next anyway. In other words, I completely agree with starting with Mesopotamia and Egypt. Where I'm lost is, why are you walking away from the founders of your civilization so quickly? Especially when you consider the breadth and depth of Egyptian history. The oldest continuous lived-in city on Earth is the city of Luxor. It was founded 3,200 BC. It is 5,200 years old. And it's been continuously lived in that entire 5,200 years.
Well played.
I mean, that in and of itself is shockingly remarkable, right? When you think about it this way, Alexander the Great went to Egypt 2,300 years ago. So when he went to Egypt, right, Luxor was already 2,900 years old. Luxor was already almost 3,000 years old. Like, just the depth and breadth to Egyptian history. How can you cover anything worth mentioning in 2 or 3 classroom periods? Let alone the fact that, there was the Great Library, and that was really late in Egyptian history. If Egypt is 6,500 years, as I'm asserting with the advent of government, then by the time they did the Great Library, which was just 2,300 years ago, they were already 4,200 years old.
Fall silent!
Compared to our 240. Dude, they get 410 and started with Jamestown. It's still a joke. But there's another really weird big problem here.
Justice.
So there is this other civilization that just completely got left out. I mean, it gets talked about a little bit when you were doing the Greeks, and it gets talked about a little bit when you're doing the Romans, but just barely. It's almost like, oh, geez, okay, I guess we have to talk about it. The Persians. And then when they get portrayed in our movies, right, the leader of the Persians is this tall, gay, black man. Right, because everybody hates tall men, gay men, and black men, so they made him the most evil imaginable person the world has ever seen, a tall, gay, black man. Which is ironic, since he's fighting the Greeks. The men who not only wore skirts, but they wore them so that they could have quick access after battle. Right? Forget the Greeks. Julius Caesar, the Roman. His name wasn't Julius Caesar, by the way. It was Gaius Julius Caesar, but it's okay. You don't need to know that. What did his men say of him? They said, Julius Caesar is a husband to all women and a wife to all men. Anyway, back to Persia. So first of all, Persia is on the Iranian plateau. The Iranian plateau was named because that's where the Aryans ended up, as in the Aryans, as in the thing Hitler was obsessed with, as in, right, what we think of as the quintessential human. You go, well, I don't. Yeah, whatever. It's not true, you know it. right? I mean, our society thinks that the average European male, to be precise, is the neutral person in the universe, the perfect person, the person that we look to, the person, so much so that they have to include one of these in every movie, right? So there's the 7 Years in Tibet. Like, they wanted to tell a story about Tibet, and they're like, oh, God, people won't watch it unless we include a Nazi. Here, let's put this German in Tibet. He really was in Tibet, but no one cared. But then they made the whole movie revolve around Brad Pitt so that you could be lured into watching a movie about Tibet. Right? Last Samurai. They had to stick Tom Cruise in there somewhere so you would go watch the movie about the Japanese being amazing. They didn't need a white guy to make that happen. But of course, if the white guy isn't there, it's so bad, this thing that I'm talking about, that they made a movie about the British stealing the Enigma machine. The way they got it was they captured a German sub. It didn't sink, they caught the damn thing. And when they got on board, they had an Enigma machine. Just for the record, it's not the British or the Americans who cracked the Enigma code during World War II. It was the Poles who did it. And right before Poland was conquered, they sent all their data to the British because they were, it was like their last. All right, we're going to get conquered, but we're not going to go down without hurting you first. And the British had this data that the Poles had been compiling, and they just needed a machine to have that last piece to crack the code. They needed a machine. And so the British go and they capture the sub. The Hollywood movie, it's an American sub. It's an American crew that captures the German sub. Really? You couldn't have made, they speak English. They're white. You couldn't have made them English? How alien are the English to us that we couldn't make a movie that was at least remotely somewhat similar to history? So back to the Persians. The Persians, those Aryans whom you hate so much that you cast them as tall, gay black men. The Persians did really amazing things. Kurosh, Cyrus the Great, when the Romans transliterated K, the Greek letter kappa, which looks just like a K, they transliterated it as a C because in Latin, C is pronounced ka, always. They never, in Latin, you don't ever pronounce the C as a sa. It's always ka. That's why it's Kaiser, not Caesar. You just, that and it's C-A-E. It's not C-E-A. How did we get Caesar out of that? Anyway, and then A-E was probably pronounced I. That's why it's Kaiser. So, Cyrus the Great is this Persian who 2,600 years ago comes up with this brilliant idea. He wants, long story short, he wants to create a massive multicultural empire. And he almost does it before he dies. I mean, he does do it, but it doesn't reach its high water mark. It'll get bigger after he dies. By the time they're done, they had actually conquered the Indus River Valley. And they had named one of the satrapies India after the Indus River, which is today in Pakistan, just to make things confusing. They had conquered Central Asia, like almost all of it. Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, that whole zone, they conquered it. All of Persia, all of Afghanistan. They conquered Egypt, the entire Middle East, except for the southern part of the Arabian Peninsula, Turkey, and they had even conquered huge swaths of what is today Greece and even a little bit of Bulgaria. They put this empire together, and then, instead of subjugating everybody and taking slaves and taking tribute and plundering people's cities, they went, welcome. Welcome to the Persian Empire. You're now members, which means you get the benefits of the empire. And instead of saying, okay, we want you to all learn Persian, they said, keep speaking whatever language you speak. That's great. Instead of saying, okay, we all want you to have our religion, they were Zoroastrian, and you're going to worship our god, Ahura Mazda, before it became a car company. Instead of doing that, they said, not only do you have freedom of religion, not only will we let you worship your own gods and have your own religion, we will actually fund your temples. We will actually do the maintenance on your temples. And if your temples are in terrible disrepair, we'll help you rebuild them. This becomes a biblical story at this point, right? The Jews show up and they go, hey, the Neo-Babylonian Empire, when they conquered Palestine and took us into slavery, they blew up our Temple of Solomon. Were you serious that you'll rebuild our stuff? And the Persians go, absolutely. And so the Jews show them the plans. They go, here, this is what the Babylonians destroyed. And the Persians are like, what the hell? That's a man-made mountain. How did they destroy that? They really hated us. They stuck in an upgrade. And the Persians went, well, we have to rebuild it, I guess. But they realized the only people on earth who had the ability to build something like that were the Egyptians. So they went and grabbed Egyptian engineers, brought them to Palestine, and with Persian gold, built the second Temple of Solomon that the Romans eventually destroyed to punish the Jews. Right? This is that empire, that Persian empire. It was an empire of tolerance. It was an empire that celebrated the different cultures. If you get a chance to go to Iran, it's very hard to do because it's hard to get a visa. Go to Persepolis. In Persian, they call it Takht-i-Jamshid. There is this staircase called the Apadana. I'm probably totally mispronouncing it. Staircase. Go and look at it. What you will see is you will see men dressed in their native dress, carrying gifts. They're carrying tribute to the Emperor Darius. But the men don't look like they're in despair and beaten down. The men are in their native dress. And the reason that the Persians did this is they wanted to show the diversity. At one point, there's a group of men who are holding hands. They're walking in a chain holding hands. Because the Persians wanted the symbolism of, we're in this together. Armenians and Jews and Arabs and Babylonians and Assyrians and Egyptians and Greeks and Tajiks and Afghans and Indians. It's one empire, but it's many people. And the way they codified all this, a Bill of Rights. The world's first ever Bill of Rights. It not only guaranteed freedom of religion, but it guaranteed you no slavery. They banned slavery, they outlawed it. They said, we won't do this. We won't reduce whole populations to subservience. If you go to New York City, go to the UN building. As you're walking in the front door, above the door in 6 languages is a text. English is one of them, so you can read it. That text is that first ever Bill of Rights from 26 centuries ago. It's written also in Persian, by the way, which is only fitting since the Persians made it. My point in bringing this up is this is the idea that some of you anyway, have embraced of multiculturalism. This is the idea that some of you have embraced with the notion the United States is a melting pot. This is the idea that some of you have embraced that you should have the right to have your own religion. And it's from Persia. It spreads from Persia to the Greeks. When the Greeks execute Socrates, one of the things that they nailed him for, one of the reasons he got the death penalty, was defaming the gods. In other words, the Athenian democracy didn't have freedom of religion like the Persian Empire did when they were executing Socrates for defaming the gods. The other one was corrupting the youth by giving them bad ideas and making them question the civilization they lived in because he thought it was deeply flawed. So how did Persia get left out of this story? Now, Persia does collapse, but then it's resurrected. It doesn't just randomly collapse. It's destroyed by a guy named Alexander the Great. But then it gets resurrected. And that resurrection is so utterly complete that you can go to Iran today and find Persians named Iskandar, Alexander. Because they don't, even though he destroys their empire, Persian Empire sub 1, they replace it with 3 more. There will be the Seleucids, and after that the Parthians, and after that the Sasanians. And so even though they have to replace their empire, they don't see him as a villain. They see him as an integral part of their history, somebody to be celebrated, somebody extraordinary. Because they saw this as this merger of civilizations, that they had become a little bit Greek in the process of Alexander conquering them, and the Greeks had become a little bit Persian in that process as well, that it was a mutual exchange of ideas and information. We don't look at it that way. We see it as this evil, dark, gross empire being destroyed by our hero, Alexander, a megalomaniac who believed that Zeus was his dad, which is why he took 15,000 men on a violent rampage through a stable empire and destroyed it and burnt their capital, destroying their library in the process, wiping out history that we'll never be able to read because it's gone, because he was a narcissist. But somehow he's the good guy and they're the bad guys, even though they're clearly the victims here. But there's something even stranger in all of this. So in the aftermath of Alexander, the Ptolemies are going to build a great library and then maintain it. Well, the great library becomes the massive repository for the world's knowledge. In a way, it was our first ever attempt at an internet, right? One location you could go to and find everything there was that was known. And they got to 1 million books. It was an extraordinary experiment. And it lasted a long time. The library was founded right around 290, and it was just BC, and it was destroyed in 391 AD. So we're talking 680 years, which is almost 7 centuries. And at that place, they made one incredible discovery after the other. The world's first ever static rocket, the world's first ever mechanical play. You turned it on, it was steam powered. It would do scenes and sounds, right? They invented geometry at the Great Library. Euclid did it. And you can go on and on. They figured out the size of the Earth. Not only did they know it was a sphere, but they knew its size. They figured out that the Earth wobbled. It does one full wobble every 26,000 years. Think about that. In 1 year, you're only measuring 1/26,000th of the wobble. They had done such amazingly precise star measurements that they, after a few years of observation, noticed this imperceptible wobble. It's called a parallax. It goes on and on. Well, our library was in Egypt. That was literally the heart of Western civilization and the brain. And somehow, we don't think of Egypt as being in the West, even though Egypt is, we give it credit as being one of the 2 founding civilizations. It was the Egyptians and the Mesopotamians. But somehow Egypt gets left out. Now, it is true the Great Library gets burnt, which means we're going to have to start over again. But the place we're starting over again is actually in the Persian Empire. Because just before the Great Library gets burnt in Alexandria, the Persians had decided they wanted a library of their own. And the people who escaped from the Roman Empire with their books, trying to get away from Theodosius, the Roman emperor, who decides to purge Roman Empire of all its non-Christians, including its non-Christian ideas. He's, by the way, the guy who ended the Olympics. He went, no, we won't do that anymore, it's pagan. Like everything had to go. All the knowledge, all the traditions. If you look at the texts of the time period of Theodosius, Emperor Theodosius, he treated the pre-Christian Romans as if they were aliens, not as if he was the descendant of them. Right? They tried to destroy all the pre-Christian statues. So they would find a statue to Emperor Marcus Aurelius, they'd melt it. They were purging the earth of everything pre-Christian. They wanted to erase it. Well, that pre-Christian stuff included Aristotle and Plato and Aristophanes and Sophocles. It included Heron and Euclid and Aristosthenes. And they were doing this at the same time the Persians were greedily gobbling that stuff up and adding it to their collection of knowledge and starting a new library at Gondishapur. But then that brings us to the next really weird moment in this East-West divide, this Western civilization thing, where we've left it out. And I didn't discover it until I was probably about 18 or 19. I'll just admit I was already obsessed with history. I realized something, and that was I didn't know anything about the Middle East during the medieval period. I knew a little bit about ancient Egypt. I knew a little bit about Mesopotamia. I remember Hammurabi, writing his crazy code. Everybody's blind and toothless. The guy was sick. So that was what we focused on, of course. Not Cyrus the Great and his, hey, worship the gods you want. I will support that monetarily. No, we focused on Hammurabi. I knew a lot about Rome. I was obsessed as a kid. And I knew a little bit about the Greeks. I didn't know anything about the Persians. Right? Like, they hadn't yet made the movie, so I didn't know they were tall, gay, and black. I knew a little bit about the Vikings, right? But I didn't know anything about medieval Middle East. And I found this book. I went to the library, and I found this book. It was written by Sir John Bagot Glubb Basha. His name is John Glubb. But you know how sometimes people get a little carried away with their names and start adding stuff to it. So Sir John Bagot Glubb Basha. Basha is a title. Obviously, so is Sir. And he had been in the British military, and when the British pulled out of what was then called Transjordan Palestine, but it got renamed Transjordan, and then it got renamed just Jordan. So today it's the Kingdom of Jordan. When the British pulled out of Jordan, he stayed behind. He went to the Jordanians and went, I don't ever want to leave. I was born British, but in my heart I'm an Arab. Let me stay. And they went, yeah, we need skilled officers. And he became a general in the Transjordanian army. And he stayed behind. And he wrote a series of books. And I got a hold of one of these books and I read it, and I couldn't believe the hole in my knowledge base. And I went and found another one of his books and I read it. And I started trying to fill this hole. And the hole was the Arabs. The Arabs, it turns out, had built this massive empire overnight that embraced knowledge and was shockingly tolerant. It was similar to the Persian Empire. In fact, it's really remarkable because if you look at the area that the Arabs conquered, they conquered everything from Spain to Pakistan when they built their empire. It was like the Persian Empire plus most of the Roman Empire combined. So it was bigger than any empire that had preceded it. One of the things that's remarkable about it was the majority of the world's Christian population was in that empire. 60% of all of Christendom was in that Muslim-ruled Arab empire. In its first couple of centuries, there were almost no Muslims in the Arab empire. They were the rulers, but they were like 5% of the population because they didn't force anybody to convert. So not only did they end up with the majority of the Christian population of Earth, but they were majority Christian also. And it was okay. They were tolerated. That Christian population was tolerated and integrated into their society because they were a tolerant empire. Now, what's remarkable about this is they began to advance human knowledge. The lens, invented by Ibn al-Haytham, the same guy who invented the camera. He's also the guy who realized that light traveled at a finite speed, in waves, and could be broken down into its constituent colors, and that all objects in the universe exert gravity on each other. He also invented the world's first ever scientific method. He stated Newton's first law of motion 600 years before Newton, dabbled in calculus 600 years before Leibniz and Newton, stated Kepler's first law of planetary motion 500 years before Kepler. There was Ibn Sina, the guy who invented modern medicine. He's also the guy who came up with the idea of singularities. He effectively postulated Big Bang. He's the guy who kicked off phenomenology that Husserl and Heidegger will later on take on and develop further. Right? There was this huge blossoming of scientific and philosophical knowledge in that time period. Ibn Khaldun, the father of political science, the father of history, the father of sociology. The Arabs invented literary studies where you would look at literary sources for the purposes of trying to figure out what the truth was, for the purpose of trying to understand. In other words, the English departments all owe their existence to these guys. How can that much be carved out of your historical knowledge when all of it is Western. That's the key to this. The knowledge that the Arabs were building off of was Western. The knowledge that they made was Western. And the answer is that what we did was we intentionally created this East-West paradigm to divorce the Arabs and the Persians from the rest of the West. That this was an intentional thing, right? Al-Khwarizmi invented algebra, algorithms, zero, Arabic numerals. You can't jettison these guys. They're too much of our foundational understanding of the universe, right? What would we be without algebra and algorithms to mine your internet activity and then launch really nice ads directly aimed at you, customized for you, to get you to buy stuff you don't need? How many times have you opened an app or something and saw the ad that was exactly about what you were just talking to somebody? It's creepy. Here's what happened in a nutshell. Europe had gone through a phase of massive intolerance under the leadership of the Romans, especially epitomized by Emperor Theodosius I. Theodosius I declared that the Roman Empire was a Christian-only empire. In other words, he was a fundamentalist Christian who decided to jettison any concept of tolerance that existed. In the process, he set into motion this idea that it was Christianity versus the rest of the world. Now, the Romans had already had enormous trouble with the Jewish population, right? And they ultimately burnt or destroyed the Second Temple of Solomon in the process. But for that matter, the Romans had trouble with the Christian population. We all know about Romans feeding Christians to the lions. But Rome is now converted to Christianity. And now they've taken all that intolerance that they had been directing towards Christianity, and now they're directing it towards everybody else. Islam is born shortly afterwards. Emperor Theodosius, right, is the late 300s, early 400s, and then Islam is born in the early 600s. So there's about 2 centuries later, Islam comes into being. And so all of that religious intolerance that had been brewing in the Roman Empire gets focused on Muslims at a time when the Muslims are conquering whole swaths of the Roman Empire. And so the Roman Empire sees itself as the victim of these people. But here's the twist. That period of time that I just referred to, where I said that Muslims were conquering the whole swaths of the Roman Empire, we have actually undone that. We've undone that conquest. And here's how we've done it. About 500 years ago, a German historian came up with the concept of the Byzantine Empire. The original name of Constantinople was Byzantion. When the Romans got there, they turned Byzantion into Byzantium. And so that's where we get the term Byzantine Empire, as in from Byzant, or in this case, Byzantium. Constantinople had been called Constantinople for centuries by the time the Roman Empire collapsed in 1453, and it was about 100 years later that this German historian came up with the term Byzantium. The Roman Empire, he's told us, died on September 4th, 476 AD. He gave us a very precise date. He said, this is when the Roman Empire died. So then when the Roman Empire was conquered by the Ottoman Empire on May 29th, 1453, it wasn't the Roman Empire that the Ottoman Empire conquered. It was the Byzantine Empire. Something that never existed. At the moment that the Roman Empire is surrendering on May 29, 1453, it called itself the Roman Empire. In other words, the Roman Empire collapsed, and then years later, it gets renamed. Well, just its last 1,000 years of existence. It would be like if the United States changed its capital from Washington, D.C. to San Francisco, right? Because that's what the Romans did. They moved their capital to Constantinople. And then, 1,000 years from now, historians come back. Let's say we change our capital to San Francisco next year. Trump decides to do it. We move the capital to San Francisco. And in 1,000 years from now, a historian comes back and renames the United States from that moment that our capital's in San Francisco on, and he calls the United States the Republic of Yerba Buena,
The light shall bring victory.
which you all love. Yeah, sorry, it's just mint. It's mint. Everybody loves mint. That was the original name of San Francisco. So I came up with that. For those of you wondering what I was really implying. Well, right? San Francisco was called Yerba Buena at the time that the United States invaded it and conquered it, and then went, this is a terrible name. Good mint? Or good herb? Who would call a city that? And then flip the name to San Francisco because it sounded cooler. I have to admit, I kind of agree. But do you see what I mean? Like, it's weird. Like, wow, you're going back and resurrecting this old name? We don't use it anymore. And you're calling the whole republic after that weird name that doesn't get used anymore? Where did this come from? And here's where it came from. I told you it was a German who came up with this. In 476 AD, there was a German named Odovaker. Isn't that a cool name? Odovaker. And Odovaker had decided that he was going to take over Italy. That's tough for the Roman Empire, though, because Italy was like the symbolic core of the Roman Empire. For all intents and purposes, the Roman Empire's capital was in Constantinople. It did have a secondary capital in Ravenna, and it had two emperors. There was the emperor in the east and the emperor in the west. The emperor in the east was Emperor Zeno, and the emperor in the west was this guy named Romulus Augustus. And Odovaker takes his armies up and down Italy, conquers it, captures Odovaker, forces the Roman Senate of the West, because there were two senates too, two emperors, two senates, forces the Roman Imperial Senate to form up, and then he gets up in front of them on April 4, 476, and he goes, I am creating the kingdom of Italy. I am the new king. He didn't say, and I'm taking it out of the Roman Empire. No, Italy will remain as part of the Roman Empire. I'm just the new king. I'm just the German king of the kingdom of Italy, which is still in the Roman Empire. But now there's no need to have a Western Roman emperor. So he tells Romulus Augustus, who I think was like 16, take off your robe. He had a purple robe. He takes it off. The Senate agrees to this. They vote for this to happen. They take off the robe. They stick it in a box. They call FedEx. FedEx comes and picks up the box, and they deliver it to Constantinople with a note saying, they probably emailed it, saying, we don't need two emperors. Emperor Zeno is enough. Romulus Augustus is abdicating. In effect, what happened on September 4, 476, is the Roman Empire sort of reunified. It switched back to having one capital, one emperor. It still had two senates. The Western Roman Senate died somewhere in the early 600s. We're not exactly sure what year. It died with such a whimper, we don't know. It didn't even vote to dissolve itself. It just sort of dissolved and never came back. Emperor Heraclius was emperor when it went away. That's all we know. Government shut down. They ran out of money, and they stopped meeting. Stopped doing their job. So they raised the debt ceiling. Or changed the calendar to accommodate the fact that they weren't allowed to have debt, so that they could have a year with 10 months in it and forever ruin my understanding of the names of the months, right? Just so irritating. Oct is 8. October should be the 8th month. And there it is, the 10th month. Really? Really? Anyway. Why is this important? Okay, great question. So, this German is rewriting history to make it so that the Roman Empire doesn't die at the hands of the Ottoman Empire, a Muslim empire. It's the Byzantine Empire that dies at the hands of the Ottoman Empire. And instead, the Germans destroy the Roman Empire. And the reason he wants this to happen is there's an institution called the Holy Roman Empire. Now, when Napoleon Bonaparte destroyed the Holy Roman Empire in 1806, he declared the Holy Roman Empire as neither Holy, Roman, nor an empire. And by the way, I agree. It was definitely not holy. It was very much not Roman, although it did have parts of Italy. And it wasn't an empire at all. It was a confederacy. It was a confederacy of German and Italian states, mostly city-states. They were sort of clumped together. The kings in the Holy Roman Empire with the electors would elect an emperor, and the emperor did have some sway. He did have some control over things, but not in the way that you would think of an emperor. Like, we're not talking Star Wars emperor here. We're not even talking like Emperor Theodosius emperor. What we're really talking about is like President of the Confederate States of America, right? There's 11 states, and we're not really sure how closely linked they are. And the guy doesn't really actually do much except get statues erected to him in 1965. And counties named after him, sometimes forts. So, this German wants the Holy Roman Empire, which is this German confederacy, to have legitimacy. If the Germans destroyed the Roman Empire, then it's the Germans who are the heirs to the Roman Empire. So then the name Holy Roman Empire has some meaning. But then to make things more interesting, the Ottomans had as their specified goal to create a new Roman Empire. Their goal was to create a Muslim Roman Empire. Their goal was to replace the old, decrepit, corrupt, dying Christian Roman Empire with a new, vibrant Muslim Roman Empire. That's why they wanted Constantinople so badly. Because once they had the capital of the Roman Empire, that would not only become their capital, and it would become a splendid capital, but it would also be an enormous symbolic gesture. We have Rome. It's done. We've done it. We've made this Muslim Roman Empire. So to delegitimize the Ottoman Empire, it became useful to have, oh no, you thought you conquered Rome? You didn't. You conquered the Byzantine Empire. We Germans, we took out Rome 1,000 years ago. Sorry, you missed it. Right? We were literally in the act of rewriting history to mean something it didn't mean, to be something it wasn't, for ideological reasons, to create this East-West divide. This East-West divide that is so weird. Catch this. Crescent moon and star is the symbol of the Ottomans, for sure. Who else? The Pakistani flag has it, but why does the Pakistani flag have it? It's the symbol of Islam. It's also the symbol of the city of Constantinople, the last capital of the Roman Empire. When the Muslims took that as their holy symbol, the crescent moon and the star, it had been the symbol, it had been the banner for the capital of the Roman Empire. In other words, the Muslims weren't creating something new. They were taking something that existed and went, that's cool, we'll take that for ourselves. If you look at the original coins that the Muslims minted, they have an emperor standing with a cross in one hand and a globus cruciger. A globus cruciger is a globe with a cross sticking out of it. The original Muslim coins had two crosses on it. And the Muslims didn't see any contradiction in the fact that they were minting Roman coins. They didn't have any Arabic script on them anywhere. The civilization that the Muslims created had indoor plumbing. Sewage water was pumped out. They created a coffee industry, a sugar industry. They resurrected ice cream. It had existed in some shape or form, went out of existence. The Arabs brought it back. It wasn't really ice cream, it was sherbet. It was ice with fruit juice. In fact, that's where we get the word sherbet from. It's from sharbat, which is just juice in Arabic. Right? Coffee comes from the Arabic word gahwa. Sukkar comes originally from a Hindi word, but through Arabic, which is just sugar, sukkar. Sif, zero, comes from Arabic. Algebra, algorithm, admiral, apricot. All those are Arabic words. They were brought in, zenith, nadir. Right? All brought in to our language and enriched our language in the process. So I'm going to go back a little bit, though. I want to talk about one other weird thing in this story. So you know the Vikings? So just disclaimer, I am a quarter Scandinavian. So when I talk about the Vikings, like enormous chunks of pride come welling up, and if I sound gross, it's because I am. Right, just for the record. I can't help it. Who here doesn't like the Vikings? Nobody raised their hand. Okay, so some of you are dishonest. Oh, okay, there. That's good, thanks. Really appreciate it. They were really mean. So the Vikings go on this tear. Now the tear that they go on is shockingly similar to what the Arabs do, except that the Arabs do it suddenly and they end up conquering a huge empire in the process. What the Vikings do takes about 3 centuries, so it's not very sudden. And the Vikings had a little bit of a cruel edge to them, just for the record, whereas the Arabs just didn't. They weren't so into the cruelty thing. But they had one thing really in common, and that was that they thought of their homeland as merely a starting point. That it was sacred, there was some religious value to it, but from an economic standpoint, from a political standpoint, it wasn't very useful. And the reason is, think about it. What is today Saudi Arabia is the starting point for the Arabs. There are no rivers. Like right there, oh my God, crappy piece of real estate. How do you function with no rivers? Where do you get your water? How do you do agriculture? Like, oh my God. You wouldn't even know the name Saudi Arabia if it wasn't for oil, because the place is basically uninhabitable. And the Arabs kind of saw it that way. They were like, oh God, here I go, another day in river-free land. The Vikings saw Scandinavia the same way. They saw it as a chunk of land that you could get trees from, you could go fishing from, you could raise dairy cows in parts of it, but you couldn't farm it, it was just too cold. And as a result, it was actually really crappy land. So one of the goals, really it's one of 2 goals, that the Vikings had when they began leaving Scandinavia and attacking places like Scotland and Ireland and England and Germany and France and Poland and Spain and Italy and Russia and Lithuania and Estonia and Latvia and Finland. Their goal was to get some agricultural land, to just be able to get out there and work the soil and plant some plants and eat some vegetables, because they were really sick of fish, beef, and cheese wheels. The other thing that the Vikings were really interested in was trade. They really thought, unlike today in the United States, that trade was the pathway to wealth. Right? That your ability to interact with other countries in a peaceful manner where you would exchange goods would generate huge amounts of wealth. Now, one of the reasons why the Vikings turned so violent was they were having a hard time trading with the rest of Europe, because Europe was 1,200 years ago extremely poor. By extremely poor, I mean Charlemagne didn't have any gold, so he had to mint all his coins in silver. Like, Europe just didn't have any resources. Paris was a city of 10,000 people, right? Like UT is 5 times bigger. The Vikings turned a little vicious on their neighbors, not just to grab their land, but also to steal goods worth selling. And one of the reasons they did this was they wanted to be able to trade with homeland. According to the Viking sagas, the Vikings were originally from Persia, and they wanted to go back to Persia and trade with them. But by the time they're getting back to Persia in the 800s, Persia has already been conquered by Muslims. So they're actually arriving in Muslim Persia. And those Muslims not only had street lamps lit up by oil, and not only did they have silk and linen and cotton, but they were experimenting with modern technology like modern medicine and modern agriculture and private property ownership and different ways of doing metal. For example, what the Arabs had realized was that the Indians knew how to make steel, not iron, steel. And so the Arabs would go to India, they'd buy steel ingots from India, and they'd bring it back and they'd make steel tools, steel swords, steel armor. And that gave them an edge on everything. And the Vikings were like, oh my God, we need a piece of this. How do we get into this? And interestingly enough, they began enslaving Northern Europe and taking those slave populations and selling them into the Persian Empire in exchange for this technology and these goods. But then something remarkable happens, and that is they start to succeed in actually conquering chunks of land. They conquer part of northern France. They will conquer England twice. They do it, lose it, and get it back. Right? The first time they capture it is under Canute the Great, and then the second time they capture it is under William the Conqueror. But one of the things that happens to the Vikings as they're conquering, by the way, they invented Russia. The Vikings invented Russia. The word Russia is a Viking word. It's from Rus, R-U-S. And what had happened was the Rus were a Viking tribe that had gotten hired by what are today Ukrainian lords, to create order in the area. The Rus show up, they beat everybody up, they create order, right? And then they realize, why are we submitting to these Ukrainians? We're taking over. And the next thing you know, the Rus are ruling Ukraine, the original Russia, and before you know it, they create Russia. And now today, Ukraine wants nothing to do with Russia. The irony is too weird. A group of these Vikings end up in Barabos, which you know today is Saragossa. It's in Spain. It's on the Ebro River. It's in northern Spain. And the Vikings took it from the Arabs. When the Vikings conquered northern France, they dumped their Viking languages and switched over to French. When the Vikings did the Rus thing, they dumped that and they switched over to Russian, right? Because the peasants were too uneducable. You couldn't teach them Swedish. So you just learned their language. It was easier. Well, when they end up in northern Spain capturing this Muslim town from the Muslims, the next thing you know, the Vikings are dressed like Muslims, they're talking like Muslims, they're adopting Muslim society, and eventually they get it in their head, why stop here, let's keep going, and they go, and in 1050 they conquer Sicily. Hrothgar, the Viking, Hrothgar, the Norman, you know him as Roger the First. He conquers Sicily. They decide, because Muslims owned Sicily, Arabic was the dominant language in Sicily at the time, they decide to adopt Arabic ways. The coins that are minted by the descendants of Hrothgar, by the descendants of Roger I, right up until Henry VI, there were a few Sicilian kings. The coins on one side have Latin, on the other side have Arabic. So these guys are Catholic Vikings ruling Arabic Sicily, which, by the way, was a multi-ethnic place to begin with. There were Greeks, and there were Phoenicians, and there were Romans, and then the Arabs came, and they sort of mingled with them. Now there's Vikings running around Sicily, and just adding another weird nation into the mix. And the Vikings, by the way, start marrying into German royal families, and the next thing you know, there's like, Sicily is basically ruled by these Germans who are mixed Viking and mixed German, and it's very complicated. In the mix, this guy comes about. His name is Frederick II, not the Great. That's a different one. Frederick II. Friedrich II. Friedrich spoke Latin, French, Sicilian. It was languages. He read Arabic texts. He conducted scientific experiments because he had learned from Arabic. He had learned from the Arabic text he was reading the scientific method. He embraced this Arab civilization, and he began advancing it. By the way, this is the 13th century. He wrote his own scientific treatise on falconry. He appears twice in the book. He had himself a